This lens was built for video, but just how good is it for landscape photography? Well, guess we gotta find out. What is up, y'all? It is your Project Photography back with another video, and today, before we get started, make sure to follow all of my socials down in the description bar below, including a brand new TikTok. So this is the Nikon 12-28mm f3.5-5.6 power zoom, and this is an incredibly interesting lens to me because this is mainly used for video, as you know, it was why I bought it. I bought it to pair with my Nikon Z30 because it has the image stabilization, and the power zoom is actually really good for video. But it's not necessarily great for landscape photography. But to me, this is a really interesting lens for landscape photography, mainly because the wide angle field of view at the widest end of this. It's essentially the equivalent of 18mm on full frame, and as you guys know, there aren't any wide angle lenses for the crop sensor system for the Nikon Z mount. So I think this, in tangent with the 67mm filter thread, actually makes a really interesting combo for landscape photographers. But in order to know if it's good for that, we have to test it out. And what we're going to be doing is tomorrow morning, we're going to be going to Abalone Cove. I think that's what it's called. I don't know. I've done a video there before, but it's been a while since I've actually gone and shot photos there. So I think that'll be a really interesting opportunity to go ahead and test this lens out. So after I get done testing it, we're going to go back to the studio and I'll go ahead and give you my first impressions of this lens for landscape photography, and probably down the road sometime I'll probably do a review on this lens. So with that being said, let's jump right into tomorrow and get right to doing some landscape photography. All right, y'all, so it is now about 6 o'clock. The sun rises in about 30 minutes, but I'm not expecting to see any sunrise going on over here. The sun is probably going to be coming up from this side. But we actually didn't end up going to Abalone Cove just because it was closed. So it doesn't open till like 9, so that'll be for another video. For this video, we are at Pelican Cove Park. So this is a place I've also shot at before, but they're actually open during sunrise. So I'm gonna go ahead and start shooting with the Nikon 12-28mm f3.5-5.6 PZ. So let's get right to it and do some POV landscape photography. All right, I'll start behind the scenes, behind the camera, putting you guys on my GoPro to get a first-person point of view of how we are shooting with this lens. So here we are at Pelican Cove. This is a place I've shot at before, and it's a pretty overcast morning. I think this is pretty typical of this area, especially in Torrance. So we're gonna make the most out of what we have. But for me, I love to use a lot of long exposures, mainly because I think we're kind of far away from the water, and I think if we can get some nice movement in the clouds, I think that'd be incredibly beneficial. So I'm gonna go ahead and take an exposure here, see what kind of composition we get. And I'm actually very happy with an image like this. And then as we go to the edited version, you can see that the colors kind of came out a little bit more. And the lighting is nice and soft, which for me is really important, especially for a morning shoot. But as you kind of saw in that photo, I think the 18mm on the wide end is actually a really nice focal length, because it's not super wide and distorted like a 14mm would be, but it's also not too punched in to the point where we can't get the entirety of the landscape. So right here, I'm switching to probably a weaker ND filter, probably close to a 3 or probably 6 stop. So as you can see here, the photo is actually I feel like the color temperatures is a little bit off. It's more towards the green side, and it's definitely a lot cooler. But as we get into post, we definitely try to correct for that. And I feel like the colors here were just really interesting, mainly because of the time of day. But I'm pretty happy with what we got, considering, you know, how it was. And I really like this photo a lot because I think we get a nice sense of curvature in the image itself, and the water movement is actually really pleasing. But kind of let's talk about before with the focal length, 18mm is very interesting. And the focal length on this lens would be the equivalent of an 18-42. For me, it's very interesting because wide angle lenses tend to have more of a, you know, they're not that long on the long end, but 42mm is getting into more of normal focal length territory, which I personally like a lot. I've always advocated for a lens that is you know, wide on the wide side, but then goes into more of a normal focal length. This lens does that. And as we see here, putting this lens into vertical orientation, the colors here was definitely a different shift relative to the other colors, but I think we get a really nice composition with the water kind of moving in. I just feel like the water plays a more of a dynamic role in this photo, which I personally like. But going on with what I was saying before, I think that because we now have a lens that's wide to more of a normal focal length, it just creates for really interesting opportunities in terms of photos you can capture. Even though, you know, this really isn't meant to be a photo lens, I feel like there's so many interesting applications for this and photography as a whole. So I really like this photo. It's probably one of the best photos I took today. And I really think that we're able to bring up a lot of those colors. We're able to really hit into that blue sort of tone. And honestly, I'm just happy with this photo overall. I think the water looks really nice. So as we keep moving on here, I really think that this is a very interesting place to shoot at. We're gonna go into more of a vertical orientation because I think I see the water kind of moving in. I really want to play into that more, getting more of a simple composition with that rock in the back, and nothing too crazy here in terms of an edit. Overall, trying to create a very simple composition and a very simple image. So can't be mad about this photo. But I think when it comes to the focal length, something we have to remember is that it's not going to be super normal. Like, we're not getting a 20-60, although that for me is like an ideal lens. This is still, you know, 42mm is not super normal. It's closer to a wide angle than it is to a normal focal length, but I really think that, you know, this is better than having something like a 14-30 where it's like a 21mm to like a 45. I mean, I'd rather have the 18mm on the wide end. So we'll go ahead and put our camera into vertical orientation, capture a lot of that water moving in. That's kind of the main thing. As you can see, the light is definitely changing a lot as we're moving on through this photo shoot. So that is the last image I'm actually going to take. Here are the two images that I really liked. I really like this one mainly because the composition was really solid, and I feel like the colors definitely might need a little bit more work, but I think this was as good as I was gonna get. And the second image I really like was just the vertical version of it. Like I said, I think the water moving in more, and you can kind of showcase that a little bit more because you're in vertical orientation, definitely makes for a much cleaner photo in my opinion. So which one was your favorite photo on this photo shoot? And let's get right back into the video. All right, y'all, so we just got done shooting. I actually think I got some pretty good photos, and overall pretty happy with them. So now we're gonna go back to my studio so I can give you my first impressions of the 12-28. So let's jump right to it and head to my studio. All right, y'all, so we are now back in the studio, and let us now talk about this lens. And I actually think I got some pretty decent photos on this photo shoot, but we have to address the big elephant in the room, and that's the power zoom. How good was it for landscape photography? First of all, I actually thought the power zoom was okay. It wasn't amazing for landscape photography, and I didn't expect it to be because it's mainly a video feature, but it didn't inhibit me from getting any of these shots that I wanted. And for me, that was the main thing. I was able to craft the compositions and capture the exact images that I wanted, mainly because the focal length was really good. However, I feel like it did cause a little bit of a nuisance when it came to actually shooting, because when I was out shooting, you know, I had to make sure that I was at the widest setting possible constantly. I couldn't see what focal length I was at, which is like kind of annoying, but it doesn't affect the actual images or the fact that I was able to grab any compositions that I wanted, because I was definitely able to shoot everything I needed to. So there wasn't necessarily a problem there. It was just a little bit of a nuisance, that's all. And I think it'd be really great if Nikon could implement some sort of, you know, software implementation into the camera so that it can tell you what focal length you're at, because I think at least knowing what focal length you're at is really important, especially for photography in particular. Maybe not so much video, but for photos, I think it's definitely a crucial thing. But one of my favorite parts about this lens was just how small and compact it was. This paired with a Nikon Z30 made for a really small, lightweight combo that I think a lot of photographers can definitely get behind, mainly because you can throw this in your bag anywhere and not have to worry about it taking up too much space. The lens itself is only 205 grams, which is twice as light as the Nikon 14-30 and makes it the lightest wide-angle lens in the Nikon Z system. And paired with the 50-250, I think would make an incredible combo, because you'll have your wide-angle lens as well as your telephoto lens to capture essentially every landscape scenario that you need. Last but not least, let us talk about the image quality, because I actually found this image quality to be pretty good for the price point that it's at, as well as the type of lens it is. First of all, it is very sharp in the corner. I mean, it has no problem rendering the 20 megapixel sensor of the Nikon Z30 at all. Once we move down to the corners, we can see it is actually still quite sharp, but you can definitely tell that there is some loss of sharpness, especially at the edge of the corners. I don't think it'd be a huge deal, especially if you're shooting on a 20 megapixel sensor, but I could definitely tell, and if you zoom in, you can definitely see that as well. But overall, for the 20 megapixel sensor, I don't think we'll have any issues rendering sharp photos. I think it'll do just fine in that department. However, I do feel like the images were a little bit flat, and maybe in part of it is because we have a crop sensor instead of a full frame sensor. But generally speaking, I kind of felt like the images lacked that micro contrast, weren't that punchy, and were a little bit flat. Now, this isn't a huge issue. This is something that can be definitely edited in post. But for me personally, I like to see the photos come out nice straight out of camera, and that's something I definitely noticed. On top of it, the colors were fine. They weren't amazing, they weren't stellar, but they were just fine for what we were capturing. So overall though, honestly, I actually thought the images were quite good out of this lens. I mean, we have to remember that this is not a $1,000 lens, it's only 350 bucks. And if you were getting into the Nikon Z system, crop sensor wise at least, so we're talking about the Nikon Z50, Z30, even the ZFC, I think this lens would be really good for landscape photography. Mainly because it is the only ultra wide that's available for crop sensor cameras. I think that, you know, even with some of the image quality faults, I don't even want to say they're false, because I just feel like this is an expensive lens. It's not meant to be that, you know, high-end lens. We still get really good images and it still renders great photos. So I think it's just when you compare it to those big dogs that you kind of find a lot of discrepancies. But I think for a lot of photographers out there, you're gonna be very happy with the images. So let me know what you think about this lens. Is this a lens that you would consider picking up for your kit for landscape photography? And for me personally, this is gonna be used mainly as a video lens, but you know, we're gonna keep on reviewing it for landscape photography. I'm gonna come out with a full review maybe in the next couple months. So anyways, guys, thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today. Please feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.